The music stopped the moment Elena Ashcombe walked through the tall double doors of the ballroom, and every candle seemed to flicker at once. She had traveled 6 hours in the cold to reach London before midnight, and now she stood frozen at the entrance, staring at the scene in front of her. Her husband, Nathaniel, the Duke of Ashcombe, was seated at the head table beside a woman in a gown of deep sapphire silk, a woman wearing the Ashcombe family sapphires around her throat, jewels that had belonged to Eleanor's own mother before her. The woman was Seraphina Vale. Eleanor did not gasp, she did not stumble. She simply stood there for a moment, her gloved hands folded in front of her, taking in the sight of her husband laughing at something Seraphina had whispered in his ear. Around the room, 300 guests slowly began to notice her presence, and the whispers began like a wave rolling toward the shore. "Is that the Duchess? I thought she was ill in the countryside. Why does Lady Vale sit where the Duchess should sit?" Eleanor lifted her chin and walked forward. Each step across the marble floor felt like a mile, yet her pace never changed, her breathing never faltered. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind during the long carriage ride, though she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it would not be necessary. She had hoped her husband's letters, cold and distant as they had become, were simply the product of a busy man's neglect, not evidence of something far more calculated. When she reached the head table, the entire room had gone silent. Even the musicians had lowered their instruments, unsure whether to continue playing. Nathaniel's face went pale as he saw his wife approaching, his mouth opening slightly as though to explain, though no words came out. Seraphina's smile faltered for only a heartbeat before she composed herself, lifting her chin in an imitation of confidence she did not fully feel. Eleanor stopped before them both, and then, with the grace of a woman who had been trained since childhood in the art of composure, she lowered herself into a slow, perfect curtsy, the kind reserved for greeting someone of equal or higher rank. She did not speak a single word, she did not need to. The curtsy itself was a message, sharper than any accusation, more devastating than any scream. It said, quite clearly, that she recognized no title being claimed here, that she saw exactly what game was being played, and that she would not lower herself to fight it with tears or shouting in a crowded room. The silence that followed was suffocating. A single dropped fork somewhere near the back of the hall rang out like a gunshot. Nathaniel rose halfway from his chair, his hand outstretched as though to stop her, but Eleanor had already straightened and turned away, walking toward the far end of the room where the dowager tables sat, as though she were merely another guest arriving late to the celebration. Lord Callum Bright, an old friend of Eleanor's late father, was the first to move. He stood from his seat near the wall and offered her his arm without a word, guiding her to a seat beside him as though nothing unusual had happened at all. His quiet act of kindness gave the rest of the room permission to breathe again, and slowly, awkwardly, conversation resumed, though every eye in the ballroom kept drifting back toward the head table, where the Duke sat frozen, his mistress's hand still resting on his sleeve. Seraphina leaned close to Nathaniel, her voice low and urgent. "You did not tell me she was returning tonight." "I did not know," Nathaniel replied, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his wife straight back across the room. "She was not due back from Ashcombe Hall for another month." "She curtsied to us," Seraphina said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite triumph, not quite fear, but a strange mixture of both. "As though we were strangers." Nathaniel said nothing. He knew his wife well enough, or thought he did, to understand that her silence was never simple. Eleanor had grown up in a household where words were currency, where her father, a solicitor known for untangling the most complicated inheritance disputes in England, had taught her that the person who spoke least often understood the most. He had taught her patience, the kind of patience that waited for the perfect moment to strike, and Nathaniel felt, for the first time since he had begun his arrangement with Seraphina, a cold thread of unease work its way down his spine. Across the room, Eleanor sat with her back straight and her expression pleasant, speaking softly with Lord Bright about the weather on the road from the countryside, about the health of her old nurse, about anything at all except the scene that had just unfolded. Inside, however, her mind was working with a clarity she had not felt in months. She had suspected, of course. The letters from her husband had grown shorter and colder over the past year. The household staff at Ashcombe Hall had grown strangely quiet whenever she asked about the Duke's activities in London. And 3 weeks ago, a letter had arrived from an anonymous source, unsigned, containing only a single line: "Return to London before the winter gala, or you may lose more than you know." She had not known what to expect. She certainly had not expected to be replaced so publicly, so boldly, as though her marriage meant nothing at all, as though 8 years of her life could be erased with a borrowed necklace and a confident smile. "You are remarkably calm," Lord Bright murmured to her, his eyes kind but sharp with concern. "I would not blame you if you were not." "Calm is a choice, Callum," Elinor said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Tonight is not the night to lose it." "And when is the night?" Elinor allowed herself the smallest, faintest smile, one that did not reach her eyes but held within it a promise. "When I have gathered everything I need." Lord Bright studied her for a long moment, remembering the young girl he had known years ago, the daughter of his dear friend, quick-witted and observant even as a child, always watching, always listening, always 3 steps ahead of the adults around her who assumed she was simply being polite. He had not seen that particular fire in her eyes for a long time. Marriage to the Duke had dimmed it, or so he had believed. Tonight, it seemed, the fire had returned. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel excused himself from Seraphina's side and made his way through the crowd, stopping guests along the way with forced pleasantries, all the while moving steadily toward the table where his wife now sat. When he finally reached her, he leaned down and spoke in a low voice meant only for her ears. "Elinor, we must speak, not here." "Must we?" Elinor did not look up at him immediately. She finished the sentence she had been saying to Lord Bright about the price of wool in the northern counties before finally lifting her eyes to meet her husband's. "I was under the impression that whatever needed to be spoken had already been said tonight, quite clearly, without a single word from me." "It is not what it appears," Nathaniel said, though even as the words left his mouth, he seemed to recognize how weak they sounded. "Then what does it appear to be, husband?" Elinor's voice remained gentle, almost sweet, and that gentleness was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "Because from where I was standing, it appeared that you introduced another woman to this room as though she wore my title. It appeared that she was wearing my mother's sapphires. And it appeared that every person in this ballroom now believes something about our marriage that I myself only just learned tonight." Nathaniel's face reddened, whether from embarrassment or anger, Elinor could not tell, and in that moment she realized she no longer cared to know the difference. "You have been gone for a year," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Recovering, they said. I did not know if you would return at all." "So you replaced me," Elinor said simply, "before I had even left the room." There was nothing Nathaniel could say to that. He stood there for a long moment, and Elinor watched something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have once been guilt, before he straightened his coat and walked away without another word, back toward the head table, back toward Seraphina, who watched his return with an expression of relief that she did not bother to hide. Elinor turned back to Lord Bright, who had watched the entire exchange without pretending to look away. "You handled that with more grace than most men could have handled a duel," he said quietly. "A duel would have been simpler," Elinor replied. "At least in a duel, both parties know they are fighting." The gala continued around them, the orchestra resuming its music, the guests slowly returning to their dances and their gossip, though the temperature of the room had shifted permanently. Elinor could feel eyes on her throughout the remainder of the evening, curious glances, pitying looks from some, calculating stares from others who wondered which side of this quiet war might prove more useful to align with. She endured it all with the same composed expression, dancing once with Lord Bright, speaking briefly with a handful of old acquaintances who approached her with careful, testing questions about her health and her plans. It was nearly midnight when she finally rose to leave, declining Nathaniel's offer of the carriage they had once shared, and instead requesting her own transportation back to the townhouse that had belonged to her father. As she stepped out into the cold night air, away from the golden light and false warmth of the ballroom, she allowed herself, for the first time all evening, to breathe deeply and let her shoulders fall. The carriage ride was quiet, the city passing by in a blur of gas lamps and shadow, and Elinor stared out the window without truly seeing any of it. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the pieces of the evening like a solicitor reviewing a case, searching for the threads that would matter most in the days ahead. She thought of the sapphires around Seraphina's throat, jewels that Nathaniel had no legal right to give away, since they belonged not to the Ashcombe estate but to Elinor's own family, passed down through her mother's line and protected under the marriage settlement her father had insisted upon before the wedding. She thought of the anonymous letter that had summoned her back to London, and wondered who among the household or the ton had sent it, and why. Most of all, she thought of the year she had spent at Ashcombe Hall, recovering not from illness exactly, though that was the story told to society, but from a slow and painful realization that her marriage had become a hollow arrangement, propped up by appearances and little else. She had used that year wisely, she reminded herself. She had read every document related to the estate that she could find. She had corresponded quietly with her father's former colleagues. She had built, brick by careful brick, a foundation that she had hoped she would never need to use. Tonight had proven that she would need it after all. When the carriage finally stopped outside her father's old townhouse, a modest but elegant building on a quiet street away from the fashionable squares where the Duke kept his residence, Elinor stepped down and looked up at the darkened windows. Her old butler, Mr. Fenimore, who had served her father for 30 years before his passing, opened the door before she even reached it, his weathered face showing no surprise at her late arrival. "Welcome home, my lady," he said simply, as though she had never left at all. "Thank you, Fenimore." Elinor stepped inside, allowing him to take her cloak, and for a moment she simply stood in the familiar entrance hall, surrounded by the portraits of her father and grandfather, men who had built their reputation on patience, precision, and the quiet accumulation of undeniable truth. "I believe," she said softly, more to herself than to him, "that I will be staying in London for quite some time." "I shall have your father's study prepared, my lady," Fenimore replied, and there was something in his tone, a knowing warmth, that suggested he understood exactly what she meant by that request. "The correspondence file and the estate documents are still exactly where you left them last spring." Elinor allowed herself a small, genuine smile for the first time that night. "Good," she said. "I have a great deal of reading to do." As she climbed the stairs to her old bedroom, past the portraits and the familiar creak of the third step from the top, Elinor thought once more of the curtsy she had offered in that crowded ballroom, of the silence that had followed it, of the way 300 people had understood, without a single word being spoken, that something significant had just occurred. She had not planned that curtsy in advance, not exactly, but some instinct deep within her, some inherited wisdom from a father who had taught her that composure was its own kind of power, had guided her through the moment with a precision she could not have rehearsed. Tomorrow she would begin in earnest. Tonight she allowed herself only this, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her husband and his mistress believed they had won something, when in truth, they had only just begun to understand what kind of woman they were dealing with. Outside her window, the lights of London glittered against the winter darkness, and somewhere across the city, in a grand townhouse near the fashionable squares, Nathaniel Ashcombe sat alone in his study long after the gala had ended, staring at a glass of brandy he had not touched, unable to shake the image of his wife's calm, unreadable face as she rose from that curtsy and walked away without a single word. He did not yet know what she intended to do. But for the first time in a very long while, he found himself afraid to find out. Serafina, in her own rooms across town, removed the sapphire necklace with trembling fingers and set it carefully in its case, staring at her own reflection in the mirror for a long moment. She had expected tears from the Duchess. She had expected anger, perhaps even a scene dramatic enough to embarrass the Duke and turn society further in her own favor. What she had not expected, what unsettled her more than she wanted to admit even to herself, was silence. A silence so complete, so deliberate, that it felt less like defeat and more like the calm before something far more dangerous. She did not sleep well that night, neither did the Duke. Elinor, however, slept soundly, wrapped in the familiar quiet of her father's house, dreaming not of the ballroom or the sapphires or the woman who had tried to steal her place, but of the documents waiting for her in the study below, of the letters she needed to write in the morning, and of the long, careful work that lay ahead of her, work that would, in time, remind an entire city exactly who the Duchess of Ashcombe truly was. The morning after the winter gala arrived grey and cold, with a light rain tapping against the windows of the townhouse, but Elinor was awake long before the sun had fully risen. She had never been a woman who slept late, even in the best of circumstances, and the events of the previous evening had given her more reasons than usual to rise early. By the time Fenimore brought her tea into the study, she had already lit the fire herself and pulled the first stack of documents from the locked drawer of her father's old desk. "You did not wait for me, my lady," Fenimore said, setting the tray down with a note of gentle reproach. "I did not wish to waste the morning," Elinor replied, not looking up from the ledger in front of her. "There is a great deal to review, and I fear I have already lost a year I cannot afford to lose again." Fenimore studied her for a moment, the same careful, assessing look he might have once given her father when a difficult case arrived at the house. "Shall I send word to Mr. Aldridge, my lady?" Your father always said he was the sharpest young barrister in London, before he took ill. Elinor looked up at that name, a flicker of memory returning to her. Julian Alderidge had trained under her father years ago, a quiet, brilliant young man with a gift for finding the smallest inconsistency buried within the largest stack of legal papers. She had not thought of him in years, but the mention of his name now felt less like a coincidence and more like a door quietly opening. "Yes," she said slowly. "Send word to Mr. Alderidge today. Tell him I would like to speak with him about my father's old cases and about my own current circumstances at his earliest convenience." "Very good, my lady." Fenimore bowed slightly and turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "If I may say so, my lady, your father would be proud of how you handled yourself last night. Word travels fast among the staff of great houses. They say you silenced the entire ballroom without raising your voice once." Elinor allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Silence has always been the family's sharpest weapon, has it not, Fenimore?" "Indeed it has, my lady," the old butler said, and then he was gone, leaving Elinor alone with the fire, the rain against the windows, and the long stack of documents that would occupy the rest of her morning. She began with the marriage settlement, the very first document her father had drawn up before her wedding to Nathaniel 8 years earlier. She had read it before, of course, on the day she signed it, though at the time she had been a hopeful young woman of 20, more concerned with the color of her wedding gown than the precise wording of legal clauses. Reading it now, with fresh eyes and a far more experienced understanding of how such documents could be used, she found herself noticing details she had never fully appreciated before. Her father had been thorough, as he always was. The settlement clearly stated that any jewelry belonging to Elinor's maternal line, including the sapphires that had been worn the previous night, remained her personal property under all circumstances, regardless of the state of her marriage. Furthermore, a significant portion of the estate's operating funds that Nathaniel had likely been relying upon to maintain his lifestyle, and she now suspected, to support Seraphina's presence in London society, were tied directly to an account that required Elinor's signature for any withdrawal beyond a modest quarterly allowance. She sat back in her chair, staring at the words on the page, and felt something settle within her, a quiet certainty that had been missing since the moment she walked into that ballroom the night before. Her father had protected her, even from beyond the grave, in ways she was only now beginning to fully understand. By midday, a reply had arrived from Julian Alderidge, agreeing to call upon her that afternoon. Elinor spent the hours before his arrival continuing her review of the estate documents, making careful notes in a leather journal that had once belonged to her father, a habit she found oddly comforting, as though his steady hand were guiding her own. When Alderidge arrived, punctual and dressed in the simple, unassuming manner of a working barrister rather than a fashionable gentleman of the ton, Elinor received him in the study with tea and a stack of documents already prepared for his review. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, bowing politely as he entered, "it has been a long time. I was sorry to hear of your father's passing, though I understand it has been some years now." "4 years," Elinor said. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Alderidge. I find myself in need of your particular expertise." He seated himself across from her, his sharp eyes already drifting toward the documents spread across the desk. "I heard something of what occurred at the gala last night," he said carefully. "Forgive me if I speak plainly, my lady, but London society does not keep secrets for long." "I would prefer plain speech," Elinor said. "It will save us both a great deal of time." Alderidge nodded, seeming to appreciate the directness. "Then tell me what you require of me." Elinor gathered her thoughts for a moment before speaking, choosing her words with the same care she had used the night before in that silent, devastating curtsy. "I require an understanding of exactly what my husband can and cannot do with the Ashcombe estate without my consent. I require to know whether the woman he presented last night has any legal standing whatsoever, now or in the future. And I require to know," she added, her voice dropping slightly, "whether there are grounds within this marriage settlement to protect myself, and eventually to hold my husband accountable, should this situation continue as it appears to be heading." Alderidge was quiet for a long moment, studying her face before he reached for the marriage settlement, and began to read through it with the careful, methodical attention that had made him, even at a young age, one of the most respected minds in his field. Elinor waited patiently, sipping her tea, watching the rain continue to fall outside the window. Finally, he looked up. Your father was a brilliant man, Lady Ashcombe. This settlement is one of the most carefully constructed documents I have reviewed in years. If what you suspect is true, if the Duke has been misusing estate funds or attempting to elevate another woman's position within his household, you are in a far stronger position than most wives in your circumstances would ever find themselves. Explain, Elinor said simply. The financial controls your father built into this agreement mean that the Duke cannot make any significant expenditure, including the purchase of jewelry, property, or even certain household staff, without your signature. If he has been doing so regardless, that alone constitutes a clear breach of the settlement, one that could be brought before the appropriate authorities and would almost certainly result in a ruling strongly in your favor. Aldridge paused, glancing at her carefully. As for the woman herself, she has no legal standing at all, regardless of what title your husband may attempt to bestow upon her socially. She cannot inherit, she cannot claim any portion of the estate, and any children she might bear him outside of your marriage would have no legitimate claim to the Ashcombe name or fortune, provided you remain his lawful wife. Elinor absorbed this information slowly, feeling the pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind, still hazy but taking shape with each passing moment. And if I wish to gather proof, she said carefully, proof of exactly how far my husband has overstepped these boundaries, how would I go about doing so without alerting him to my intentions? Aldridge leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since he had arrived, something like genuine interest sparked behind his careful, professional demeanor. That Lady Ashcombe would require patience, discretion, and access to certain financial records that the Duke likely believes are secure. Fortunately, he added, with the faintest hint of a smile, your father trained me well in exactly that kind of work. Elinor felt, for the first time since walking into that ballroom the night before, something that resembled genuine hope. Then, Mr. Aldridge, she said, I believe we have a great deal of work ahead of us. Outside, the rain continued to fall over London, washing the streets clean and somewhere across the city. In the grand townhouse he shared with secrets he believed were still hidden, the Duke of Ashcombe had no idea that the quiet, composed woman he had humiliated the night before was already, methodically and without a single wasted word, beginning to build the case that would eventually bring his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. 3 days after her meeting with Julian Aldridge, Elinor received an invitation she had not expected. It came from the Dowager Countess of Marlow, a formidable woman known throughout London for her sharp tongue and her long memory, both of which had made her feared and respected in equal measure for over 4 decades. The invitation requested Elinor's presence for afternoon tea, and though the wording was polite and unremarkable, Elinor understood immediately that this was no ordinary social call. She arrived at the Countess's grand townhouse at the appointed hour, dressed simply but elegantly, and was shown into a drawing room filled with the scent of fresh flowers despite the winter chill outside. The Countess herself sat near the fire, a small, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair swept into an elaborate style, watching Elinor's entrance with the same calculating gaze she might use to assess a horse before a purchase. Duchess, the Countess said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. Sit. I have wanted to speak with you for some time, though I confess your husband's little display at the gala has given our conversation a certain urgency it did not previously possess. You are kind to receive me, Lady Marlow, Elinor said, seating herself with practiced grace. Kindness has nothing to do with it, the Countess said briskly, pouring tea for them both without waiting for a servant. I knew your mother, you understand, and I knew your father even better. He once saved my late husband from a scandal that would have ruined our family entirely, a matter of a forged signature on a shipping contract, if I recall correctly. I have never forgotten that debt, even after all these years. Elinor accepted the cup of tea offered to her, listening carefully. She had learned through years of careful observation that women like the Countess rarely spoke without purpose, and she suspected this conversation was building toward something important. I tell you this, the Countess continued, because I believe you may need allies in the coming weeks, and I intend to be one of them, provided you prove yourself worthy of the effort which I suspect, after witnessing your composure at the gala, you very well might be. What have you heard, Lady Marlow? The Countess set down her teacup with a sharp click against its saucer. I have heard that the Duke has been far less discreet than he believes himself to be. I have heard that Lady Vale has been telling certain friends of mine, in strictest confidence of course, that she expects to be formally presented at court within the year, as though such a thing were even remotely possible while you remain his lawful wife. And I have heard," she added, her eyes narrowing slightly, "that this is not the first time your husband has strayed, though it is certainly the boldest, most reckless display he has ever made of it." Elinor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at this last piece of information, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "The first time," she repeated quietly. "You did not know?" The Countess studied her face for a long moment, then sighed, a note of something almost like sympathy entering her sharp voice. "Forgive me, child. I assumed, given your composure, that you already understood the full extent of the situation. There was another woman 2 years ago before your illness sent you to the countryside. It did not last long, and it was handled with far more discretion than this current arrangement. I had assumed you knew, and that your departure to Ashcombe Hall was, in part, a response to it." Elinor sat very still, absorbing this new information, feeling the careful foundation of understanding she had built over the past 3 days shift slightly beneath her. She had suspected her marriage was troubled, had suspected her husband's affections had wandered, but to learn that this pattern had existed for years, hidden from her entirely, added a new and troubling dimension to everything she had been planning. "Thank you for telling me, Lady Marlowe," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath it. "I would rather know the full truth than continue operating in ignorance." "Good," the Countess said, nodding approvingly. "That is precisely the attitude that will serve you well in what is to come. Now tell me, Duchess, what exactly do you intend to do about all of this? Because I do not believe for one moment that a woman capable of silencing an entire ballroom with nothing but a curtsy intends to simply retreat quietly back to the countryside and accept her fate." Elinor considered her words carefully before answering. She had not yet spoken of her plans to anyone beyond Aldridge and indirectly Fenimore, and she was not certain how much she wished to reveal, even to a woman who claimed to be an ally. But something in the Countess's sharp, knowing gaze told her that half-truths would not be well received here. "I intend to understand exactly what my husband has done with his finances and with his affections, and I intend to ensure that whatever consequences follow are consequences of his own making, not mine," Elinor said. "Beyond that, Lady Marlowe, I have not yet decided what shape my future will take. That will depend, I believe, on what I discover in the weeks ahead." The Countess smiled, a thin, satisfied expression that transformed her severe features into something almost warm. "A wise answer, Duchess, very wise indeed. I shall tell you this much in return for your honesty. There is a woman in my employ, a former lady's maid who once worked in the Ashcombe household before she came to me 2 years ago. She left under circumstances that were never fully explained, though I have my suspicions now, given what you have told me today. I believe she might have information that would be of great value to you, if you were willing to speak with her." "I would be very willing," Elinor said quickly. "Then I shall arrange it," the Countess said. "Her name is Margaret Wren, and she is a discreet, sensible woman who will not embellish or exaggerate what she knows. I trust her judgment, which is more than I can say for most people in this city." The two women spoke for another hour, the Countess sharing pieces of gossip and observation that painted an increasingly detailed picture of the past several years of Elinor's marriage, details that Elinor had been entirely unaware of during her long absence at Ashcombe Hall. By the time she left the townhouse, the winter afternoon had already begun to fade into evening, and Elinor walked to her waiting carriage with a heavier heart than she had carried when she arrived, though also, strangely, with a clearer sense of purpose than before. She returned home to find Aldridge waiting for her in the study, several documents spread across the desk, his expression carefully composed in a way that told Elinor immediately that he had found something significant. "You look as though you have news," Elinor said, removing her gloves as Fenimore took her cloak. "I do, my lady, though I am not certain whether it is welcome news or not." Aldridge gestured toward the documents. "I have spent the past 3 days examining the estate's financial records, working through contacts at the bank who owed favors to your father. What I have found is troubling, though perhaps not entirely surprising given what you already suspected." Elinor seated herself across from him, folding her hands in her lap and waiting for him to continue. "Over the past 18 months, significant sums have been withdrawn from the estate's accounts, sums that exceed the quarterly allowance permitted under your marriage settlement," Aldridge explained, sliding several ledger pages across the desk toward her. "These withdrawals appear to correspond with the purchase of jewelry, a leased townhouse in a fashionable part of the city, and various other expenditures that I believe, based on the timing and nature of the purchases, were made on behalf of or in connection with Lady Vale. Alina examined the figures carefully, her trained eye picking out the pattern immediately, the same pattern she had learned to recognize from years of watching her father review similarly troubling documents. "This is a substantial sum, Mr. Aldridge." "It is," he agreed. "And more troubling still, several of these withdrawals bear a signature that appears to be yours, my lady, though I suspect, given that you were residing at Ashcombe Hall during this period, that the signature is not genuine." Alina felt a fresh wave of anger rise within her, sharper and more focused than anything she had felt since the night of the gala. Forgery was a serious crime, one that could carry severe legal consequences, and the realization that her husband or someone acting on his behalf had been willing to commit such an act in order to fund his mistress's lifestyle filled her with a cold, determined resolve. "Can you prove this, Mr. Aldridge? Can you prove that the signature is false?" "I believe so, my lady, though it will require careful work. I have already begun comparing the signature in question against verified examples of your handwriting from correspondence held by your father's old office. The differences, while subtle, are present, and I am confident that a qualified expert would be able to confirm my findings if the matter were ever brought before the appropriate authorities." Alina sat back in her chair, staring at the ledger pages spread across the desk, feeling the weight of what she had just learned settle over her like a heavy winter cloak. Forgery, misappropriation of funds, a pattern of infidelity stretching back years, a mistress being groomed for a position that legally did not exist. The picture that had begun to form during her conversation with the Countess was now becoming darker and more complex with each new piece of evidence Aldridge uncovered. "There is one more matter I must bring to your attention, my lady," Aldridge said carefully, and something in his tone made Alina look up sharply. "During my review of the household staff records, I discovered that a lady's maid named Margaret Wren left the Ashcombe household rather abruptly 2 years ago, around the same time these financial irregularities appear to have begun. The circumstances of her departure were never formally documented, which is unusual for a household as meticulously run as your husband's staff typically is." Alina's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the same name the Countess had given her only hours earlier. "It seems, Mr. Aldridge, that our investigations are beginning to converge on the same threads. Lady Marlowe mentioned this same woman to me this very afternoon and has offered to arrange a meeting between us." Aldridge looked genuinely surprised for the first time since Alina had known him. "That is a fortunate coincidence, my lady, though I have learned in my profession to be somewhat suspicious of fortunate coincidences. Whatever this Margaret Wren witnessed during her time in your household, it seems to have left enough of an impression that 2 separate sources have independently pointed us toward her." "Then we shall speak with her as soon as possible," Alina said, rising from her chair and moving toward the window, staring out at the darkening street below. "I begin to suspect, Mr. Aldridge, that what happened at that gala was merely the visible surface of something far deeper and more troubling than either of us initially realized." "I share that suspicion, my lady," Aldridge said quietly, "and I would counsel patience and caution as we continue. If your husband or Lady Vale become aware that we are investigating these matters before we have gathered sufficient proof, they may attempt to destroy evidence or otherwise obstruct our efforts." Alina nodded slowly, turning back to face him, her expression once again composed and determined. "Then we shall proceed carefully, Mr. Aldridge, but we shall proceed. I did not return to London to be humiliated in silence, and I do not intend to leave it having accomplished nothing more than enduring that humiliation gracefully. My husband has made his choices. Now I intend to ensure that he understands the full consequences of them." As the evening settled fully over London, Alina stood at her window for a long while after Aldridge had departed, watching the gas lamps flicker to life along the street, thinking of her father's careful, patient wisdom, of the Countess's sharp warnings, and of a lady's maid named Margaret Wren who might hold the key to understanding exactly how deep the deception surrounding her marriage truly ran. Somewhere across the city, she knew, her husband and his mistress were likely celebrating what they believed to be a victory, entirely unaware of the quiet, methodical storm that was beginning to gather against them, built not from anger or desperation, but from patience, precision, and an unshakable determination to see justice done. Meanwhile, in the grand townhouse Nathaniel had leased for Seraphina near the fashionable end of the city, a very different conversation was taking place. Serafina paced the length of her drawing room, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease that she could not quite shake since the night of the gala. She said nothing, Serafina repeated for what felt like the 100th time since that evening. Not a single word, Nathaniel. What sort of woman says nothing? A composed one, Nathaniel replied from where he sat near the fire, though his own voice carried none of the confidence it once had. It means nothing, Serafina. She will return to the countryside within a fortnight as she always does, and this will all be forgotten. But Serafina was not so certain, and neither, in the quiet corners of his mind that he refused to acknowledge even to himself, was Nathaniel. Something about the calm, deliberate way Elinor had risen from that curtsy and walked away without a backward glance suggested a woman who had no intention of retreating quietly into the countryside ever again. Margaret Wren arrived at Elinor's townhouse 2 days later, on a grey morning with sleet tapping softly against the windows. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with a plain, honest face and eyes that carried the wariness of someone who had learned the hard way that speaking freely could carry consequences. Fenimore showed her into the study, where Elinor and Aldridge waited, a fresh pot of tea already prepared to help put their visitor at ease. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Wren," Elinor said gently, gesturing toward a comfortable chair near the fire. "Lady Marlowe speaks very highly of you, and I understand you may have once worked in my own household." Margaret sat carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing, studying Elinor's face as though trying to determine whether she could truly be trusted. "I did, my lady. 3 years I served as lady's maid to the Duke's household, before I left rather suddenly." "Might I ask why you left so suddenly?" Elinor kept her voice soft, patient, understanding that whatever this woman had witnessed had clearly left a lasting impression. Margaret glanced briefly at Aldridge, then back at Elinor, and seemed to gather her courage before speaking. "I left, my lady, because I witnessed something I was not meant to see, and I was told, quite plainly, that my continued employment depended on my silence about the matter. When I found I could not stay silent and continue serving in that house with a clear conscience, I chose to leave instead." Elinor felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she kept her expression calm and encouraging. "What did you witness, Mrs. Wren?" Margaret took a deep breath before continuing. "It was about 2 years ago, my lady, not long after you had gone to Ashcombe Hall for your health. I was asked, along with the head housekeeper, to prepare documents for the Duke's private secretary, papers that required a signature matching your own hand. I did not think much of it at first, my lady, believing perhaps you had sent instructions ahead of your departure. But when I asked the housekeeper about it directly, she grew very uncomfortable and told me it was not my place to question such matters." "Were you asked to forge these signatures yourself?" Aldridge interjected carefully. "No, sir, not myself directly. But I saw the private secretary, a man named Mr. Harding, practicing your ladyship's signature from old letters, comparing them against a fresh sheet of paper over and over late into the evening. When I mentioned what I had seen to the housekeeper, she warned me most severely never to speak of it again, under threat of losing my position and my references entirely." Elinor exchanged a quick glance with Aldridge, who was already making careful notes on a fresh sheet of paper. "And is this Mr. Harding still employed by my husband?" "I believe so, my lady, though I have not had contact with the household in 2 years. He was the Duke's private secretary at the time, and given how carefully he guarded certain matters, I suspect the Duke trusted him a great deal with the household's private affairs." Elinor leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Wren, I understand this is difficult, and I am deeply grateful for your honesty. But I must ask you directly, would you be willing to provide a written statement of what you witnessed, and would you be willing, if necessary, to speak of it before the appropriate legal authorities?" Margaret hesitated for a long moment, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I have a new position now, my lady, with Lady Marlowe's household, and I have worked hard these past 2 years to rebuild the reputation I feared I had lost by leaving so suddenly. I do not wish to risk that stability." "I understand your hesitation completely," Elinor said gently, "and I would never ask you to risk your livelihood without offering you protection in return. I give you my word, Mrs. Wren, that whatever assistance you provide will be met with my gratitude and my protection. Lady Marlowe has already vouched for your character, and I intend to ensure that your position with her, and any future position you might seek, remains entirely secure regardless of what happens with my husband." Margaret studied Eleanor's face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her because she finally nodded slowly. "Very well, my lady. I will provide a written statement, and I will speak the truth if I am called upon to do so. What was done in that household was wrong, and it has weighed on my conscience for 2 years now. I am glad, in a strange way, to finally have the chance to set it right." Aldridge spent the next hour carefully recording Margaret's statement, asking detailed questions about dates, about the appearance of the documents she had seen, about the specific words used by the housekeeper when warning her to remain silent. By the time the interview concluded, they had gathered a piece of evidence that, combined with the financial irregularities Aldridge had already uncovered, painted an increasingly damning picture of the deception that had been carried out against Eleanor during her absence. After Margaret departed, promising to send her written statement within the week, Eleanor sat quietly in the study for a long while, staring into the fire, processing everything she had learned over the past several days. The betrayal she now understood ran far deeper than she had initially believed on the night of the gala. It was not simply a matter of her husband's wandering affections, painful as that alone would have been. It was a calculated, sustained pattern of deception, involving forged signatures, misappropriated funds, and a household staff either complicit or too frightened to speak against their employer. "You are quiet, my lady," Aldridge observed, gathering his notes and papers into a neat stack. "I am thinking, Mr. Aldridge, about how many people must have known what was happening while I was away, recovering from what everyone believed to be simple illness, and said nothing to me." Eleanor's voice was steady, though there was a weariness beneath it that had not been present before. "It is one thing to be betrayed by a husband. It is another to realize how many others allowed that betrayal to continue unchecked." "Fear is a powerful silencer, my lady," Aldridge said quietly. "Mrs. Wren herself only found the courage to speak because she trusted your character, and because Lady Marlowe's protection gave her the security to do so. I suspect there are others within the Ashcombe household who might speak similarly, given the right circumstances and assurances." Eleanor considered this for a moment, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "Perhaps, Mr. Aldridge, it is time I paid a visit to Ashcombe House myself, under the guise of retrieving some personal belongings I left behind before my departure to the countryside last year. It would give me an opportunity to observe the household directly, and perhaps to speak quietly with certain members of staff who might be willing to confirm what Mrs. Wren has told us." "That could be valuable, my lady, though I would caution you to proceed carefully. If the Duke or Lady Vale suspect that you are actively investigating them, they may take steps to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses before we have gathered sufficient proof to proceed formally." "I have no intention of announcing my purpose, Mr. Aldridge," Eleanor said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "I intend simply to be a quiet, unremarkable wife retrieving her belongings. My husband has never paid particularly close attention to my comings and goings. I doubt he will begin doing so now." The following afternoon, Eleanor sent word ahead to Ashcombe House announcing her intention to collect several personal items from her former chambers, framing the visit as a simple, practical matter unconnected to the events of the gala. She arrived at the grand townhouse in the early afternoon, when she knew Nathaniel would likely be occupied with business matters at his club, and was greeted at the door by the household's head housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Aldworth who had served the family for over a decade. "Your Grace," Mrs. Aldworth said, her expression carefully neutral as she curtsied, "we were not expecting your visit until later in the week." "I found myself with a free afternoon, Mrs. Aldworth, and thought it best to attend to the matter promptly." Eleanor kept her tone light and unremarkable as she stepped into the entrance hall she had once called home, feeling a strange mixture of familiarity and distance as she took in the surroundings. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I have someone assist you with your former chambers?" "That will not be necessary, thank you. I recall the way perfectly well." Eleanor offered a small, polite smile and made her way toward the grand staircase, though instead of proceeding directly to her former chambers, she paused briefly near the servants' corridor, listening to the quiet murmur of activity below stairs. She spent nearly an hour in her old rooms, genuinely gathering several personal items she had left behind, books and letters and small keepsakes that held sentimental value beyond anything material. But as she worked, she also paid careful attention to the household around her, noting which servants seemed nervous in her presence, which ones avoided her gaze entirely, and which ones offered small, sympathetic glances that suggested they knew far more than they were permitted to say. It was on her way back down the staircase, her arms full of gathered belongings, that she encountered a young footman she did not immediately recognize, standing near the base of the stairs with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. "Your Grace," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard, "might I have a brief word if it would not trouble you?" Elinor paused, studying the young man's face carefully. "Of course, what is your name?" "Thomas Ellery, Your Grace. I have served in this household for just over a year now." He hesitated, clearly working up the courage to continue. "I do not wish to speak out of turn, Your Grace, but I overheard something recently that I believe you ought to know, given what happened at the gala. I have thought of little else since that night." Elinor felt her pulse quicken once again, the same careful, patient attention she had learned from her father settling over her, as she waited for the young footman to continue. "Please speak freely, Thomas. I promise you, whatever you tell me will not put your position at risk." Thomas glanced around once more before lowering his voice further. "3 nights ago, Your Grace, I was asked to deliver a letter to Lady Vale's residence, quite late in the evening. While I waited in the entrance hall for a reply, I overheard part of a conversation between Lady Vale and her lady's maid. Lady Vale seemed most concerned that you might attempt to bring legal action against the Duke, and mentioned something about documents that needed to be, in her words, made to disappear before any solicitor could examine them." Elinor's breath caught slightly, though she maintained her composed exterior. "Did she mention what documents specifically, Thomas?" "I could not hear precisely, Your Grace, though I believe it had something to do with financial records, papers kept in the Duke's private study here at Ashcombe House. Lady Vale seemed to believe that if those particular documents were destroyed, there would be no evidence remaining of certain expenditures made on her behalf." This confirmation, arriving so soon after Margaret Wren's testimony, sent a fresh wave of urgency through Elinor's careful planning. If Serafina was already growing concerned enough to consider destroying evidence, it meant that time was more limited than Elinor had initially believed. "Thank you, Thomas," Elinor said quietly. "You have done me a great service today, and I will not forget your courage in coming forward. Please continue your duties as normal and say nothing of this conversation to anyone in the household. If circumstances change, I may need to call upon you again, and I promise you that your position and your future will remain secure regardless of what happens." Thomas nodded, visibly relieved to have shared what he knew, and quickly returned to his duties as Elinor made her way toward the entrance hall, her belongings gathered and her mind already racing with the implications of what she had just learned. She needed to reach Aldridge immediately before any further time passed, to ensure that whatever documents remained in the Duke's private study could be secured or copied before Serafina's growing panic led to their destruction. As her carriage pulled away from Ashcombe House, Elinor allowed herself a moment to reflect on how quickly the pieces were beginning to assemble themselves, each new witness and each new document adding weight and clarity to a case that only days ago had existed as little more than suspicion and instinct. Her husband and his mistress believed they were still in control of the situation, still confident that Elinor's composed silence indicated weakness rather than careful, patient preparation. They had no idea how wrong they truly were, and Elinor intended to keep it that way for as long as necessary, until the moment arrived when the full truth could no longer be hidden or denied. Aldridge listened with grave attention as Elinor recounted her conversation with young Thomas Ellery, his pen moving quickly across a fresh page as he recorded every detail she could remember. When she finished, he set down his pen and rubbed his tired eyes for a moment before speaking. "This changes our timeline considerably, my lady. If Lady Vale is already concerned enough to discuss destroying evidence, we cannot afford to wait weeks or months to build our case through careful, methodical means. We must secure copies of whatever documents remain in the Duke's private study as quickly as possible, before she convinces him to act on her concerns." "I agree," Elinor said, pacing slowly in front of the fire. "But I cannot simply return to Ashcombe House and demand access to my husband's private study without raising suspicion. He would certainly question such a request, particularly so soon after my previous visit." Aldridge considered this for a long moment. "What of the household staff, my lady? You mentioned that young Thomas seemed genuinely sympathetic to your circumstances. Might he be willing to assist further, perhaps by making note of which documents are kept in the study, or by alerting us if he observes any attempt to remove or destroy them. It is possible, Elinor said slowly, though I am hesitant to ask too much of him. He has already taken a considerable risk simply by speaking with me today. Then perhaps, Aldridge suggested carefully, we might consider a different approach entirely. Rather than attempting to secure the documents ourselves, we could focus our efforts on gathering sufficient testimony and financial evidence from external sources, such as the bank records I have already obtained, to build a case that does not depend entirely on documents that might be destroyed. Mrs. Wren's statement, combined with the financial irregularities I have already identified through the bank, may prove sufficient on their own. Elinor nodded slowly, appreciating the wisdom in this more cautious approach. You are right, of course. I have been so eager to move quickly that I nearly allowed myself to take unnecessary risks. Let us proceed as you suggest, Mr. Aldridge, focusing our efforts on the evidence we can gather safely and reliably. Over the following 2 weeks, Elinor and Aldridge worked steadily and carefully, building their case piece by piece. Aldridge secured formal signed statements from bank officials who had processed the questionable withdrawals, confirming that the signatures on several transactions did not match verified samples of Elinor's genuine handwriting. Margaret Wren's written statement arrived as promised, detailed and precise, corroborating everything she had told them in person. And through careful, discreet inquiries conducted by Aldridge among his professional contacts, they learned that Mr. Harding, the private secretary young Thomas had mentioned in relation to the practiced forgeries, had recently made several large personal purchases that seemed inconsistent with his modest salary, suggesting he may have been compensated for his cooperation in the deception. During this period, Elinor also continued to move carefully through London society, attending select social gatherings where she knew Nathaniel and Seraphina would likely be present, maintaining always the same composed, unreadable demeanor that had so unsettled the ballroom on the night of the gala. She never raised her voice, never made accusations, never gave any outward indication of the careful work being conducted behind the scenes. This composure, she had come to understand, was itself a powerful tool, one that kept her husband and his mistress uncertain and increasingly anxious about what she might be planning. At a small dinner party hosted by Lord Bright roughly 2 weeks after her initial meeting with Margaret Wren, Elinor found herself seated across from Nathaniel for the first time since the gala. The tension between them was palpable, though the other guests, carefully selected by Lord Bright for their discretion, did their best to maintain polite conversation around the awkward silence that had settled over the couple. You have been keeping yourself busy, Elinor, Nathaniel said quietly, during a rare moment when the surrounding conversation had drifted elsewhere. I have heard reports of your comings and goings from various sources. I have found London to suit me better than the countryside of late, Elinor replied smoothly, not looking up from her plate. I trust you have no objection to my presence in the city. Of course not, Nathaniel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I simply wonder what has kept you so occupied these past 2 weeks. You have visited Lady Marlowe on several occasions, and I understand you called upon our household to retrieve some belongings recently as well. Elinor finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since the confrontation at the gala. Is there some reason my activities concern you, Nathaniel? I was under the impression that you had made your own priorities quite clear on the night of the gala. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elinor thought he might respond with anger, but instead he simply looked away, his expression troubled. I do not wish for this to become a war between us, Elinor. Whatever has happened, whatever mistakes I have made, I do not believe either of us benefits from a prolonged conflict. Then perhaps, Elinor said quietly, her voice carrying just enough of an edge to make her meaning clear without alerting the other guests to the true weight of their conversation. You should have considered that before you chose to humiliate me in front of 300 witnesses. She did not wait for his response, instead turning her attention back to the guest seated on her other side, effectively closing the conversation. But she noted, with quiet satisfaction, the flicker of genuine unease that crossed her husband's face before he, too, returned his attention to the meal. Later that evening, as the guests began to depart, Lord Bright drew Elinor aside for a private word. You handled that exchange with remarkable restraint, he said quietly. I confess I expected something rather more dramatic, given the circumstances. Drama serves no purpose, Callum, Elinor replied. I am building something far more lasting than a single dramatic scene could ever achieve. And how close are you to completing this work of yours? Elinor considered the question carefully before answering. Closer than my husband realizes, I believe. Mr. Aldridge tells me we have gathered sufficient evidence to bring formal proceedings, should I choose to pursue that path. The question that remains is not whether I have the evidence, but what I wish to do with it once the moment arrives to reveal it. What do you wish to do with it? Lord Bright asked gently. Elinor was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the London night through the tall windows of Lord Bright's townhouse, considering the question with the same careful deliberation she had applied to everything else over the past several weeks. I wish for the truth to be known, Callum. I wish for my husband to understand fully the consequences of what he has done, not simply to me, but to the trust and responsibility that comes with his position. And I wish, she added, her voice softening slightly, for Lady Vale to understand that her ambitions, however carefully constructed, were built upon a foundation that never truly existed and never could. And beyond that, what of your marriage, Elinor? What of your own future? Elinor turned to face him fully, and in her eyes, Lord Bright saw something that had not been present during their conversation weeks earlier at the gala, a clarity and determination that had crystallized through the careful work of the intervening weeks. That, Callum, will depend entirely on what my husband chooses to do once the truth becomes undeniable. I no longer intend to wait quietly for circumstances to resolve themselves. I intend to shape those circumstances myself, and whatever future emerges from that work will be one that I have chosen, rather than one that was simply imposed upon me. 3 days later, a development occurred that neither Elinor nor Aldridge had fully anticipated. A letter arrived at the townhouse, delivered by an unfamiliar messenger boy who departed before Fenimore could question him about its origin. The letter, unsigned like the one that had originally summoned Elinor back to London, contained a brief but urgent warning. The Duke's private secretary had been dismissed from his position that very morning, and certain documents from the household's private study had already been removed, their current location unknown. Elinor read the letter twice, her mind racing through the implications. If Mr. Harding had indeed been dismissed and documents removed, it suggested that Nathaniel or Seraphina had grown suspicious enough of the ongoing investigation to take drastic action, potentially destroying evidence that could have strengthened their case considerably. She immediately sent word to Aldridge, requesting his presence at the townhouse as soon as possible. When he arrived within the hour, his expression grave upon reading the letter himself, Elinor voiced the concern that had been building within her since she first read the warning. Do you believe we have waited too long, Mr. Aldridge? Have we allowed them the opportunity to destroy the very evidence we sought to preserve? It is possible, my lady, Aldridge admitted carefully, though I would remind you that we have already secured substantial evidence independent of anything that might have been removed from the private study. The bank records, Mrs. Wren's testimony, and now, potentially, testimony regarding this sudden dismissal of Mr. Harding, all of this exists entirely outside of what the Duke or Lady Vale might attempt to destroy. But if Harding has been dismissed, might he not be willing to speak more freely about what he knows, now that his loyalty to the household no longer serves any purpose? Elinor asked, a new possibility forming in her mind. Aldridge considered this thoughtfully. That is an intriguing thought, my lady. A dismissed employee, particularly one who may feel he has been treated unfairly after years of service, might indeed be persuaded to share information he would have previously kept confidential out of loyalty or fear. It would require careful, tactful approach, but it could prove valuable. Then let us find him, Elinor said firmly, rising from her chair with renewed determination. If Mr. Harding has information that could further clarify the extent of what has occurred, I believe it is worth the effort to seek him out before my husband or Lady Vale think to silence him through other means. The search for Harding's current whereabouts occupied Aldridge's attention over the following 2 days, drawing upon his network of professional contacts throughout London to track the movements of a man who had, until recently, held a position of considerable trust within the Ashcombe household. Elinor waited anxiously during this period, aware that each passing day increased the risk that Nathaniel and Seraphina might take further steps to protect themselves, whether through destroying additional evidence or through intimidating potential witnesses into silence. Finally, on the 3rd day, Aldridge arrived at the townhouse with news that Harding had been located, staying at a modest inn near the eastern edge of the city, apparently unwilling or unable to secure alternative employment following his sudden dismissal. Elinor listened carefully as Aldridge outlined a plan for approaching the former secretary, one that would require both discretion and careful negotiation to secure his cooperation. "We must proceed carefully, my lady," Aldridge cautioned. "A man who has already demonstrated willingness to forge documents for financial gain may prove difficult to trust entirely, even if he is now willing to speak against his former employer. We must verify whatever information he provides against evidence we have already gathered, rather than accepting his testimony alone as sufficient proof." Elinor nodded, understanding the wisdom in this caution, though she felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through the past several weeks of careful, methodical work. "Then let us proceed, Mr. Aldridge, with all the care and precision this situation demands. We have come too far to allow carelessness to undermine everything we have worked to build." The inn where Mr. Harding had taken lodging was a modest establishment, far removed from the grandeur of Ashcombe House, and when Elinor arrived accompanied by Aldridge 2 days later, she found the former secretary looking considerably diminished from the confident, well-dressed man she remembered from her years in the household. He sat in a small private room Aldridge had arranged for their meeting, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a cup of weak tea. "Your Grace," he said, rising quickly and bowing with a nervousness that suggested he understood exactly why she had come to find him, "I did not expect. That is, I was not aware you knew of my circumstances." "Please sit, Mr. Harding," Elinor said gently, taking the seat across from him while Aldridge remained standing near the door, watching the exchange with careful attention. "I understand you were recently dismissed from your position with my husband's household." Harding's face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of shame and resentment. "Dismissed without notice, Your Grace, after 8 years of loyal service. Lady Vale insisted upon it, claiming I had grown careless with certain confidential matters, though I believe the true reason was that I had begun to express doubts about the wisdom of continuing certain arrangements." "What arrangements, Mr. Harding?" Elinor asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral though her pulse had quickened at his words. Harding hesitated, glancing nervously toward Aldridge before returning his gaze to Elinor. "Your Grace, I find myself in a difficult position. I committed certain acts during my employment that I am not proud of, acts that were, I believe, illegal under the law. I fear that speaking of them may bring consequences upon myself that I am not prepared to face." Elinor leaned forward slightly, her expression softening with genuine understanding. "Mr. Harding, I will speak plainly with you. I already possess substantial evidence of the forgeries committed under your direction, evidence that includes sworn testimony from a former member of the household staff who witnessed you practicing my signature. I am not here to threaten you or to demand your cooperation through fear. I am here because I believe you may have information that could help clarify the full extent of what has occurred, and because I believe that a man who chooses honesty now, after years of complicity, deserves some measure of consideration for that choice." Harding stared at her for a long moment, and Elinor could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, years of loyalty and fear warring against a growing resentment toward the household that had so casually discarded him after years of service. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision, his shoulders sagging slightly as though releasing a weight he had carried for far too long. "Very well, Your Grace. I will tell you what I know, though I ask that you consider my cooperation when determining what consequences I might face for my own actions in this matter. I give you my word, Mr. Harding, that I will speak on your behalf regarding any leniency that might be appropriate, given your willingness to cooperate now." Over the following hour, Harding provided a detailed account of the deception he had participated in over the past 2 years, confirming much of what Elinor and Aldridge had already pieced together while adding significant new details. He explained that Nathaniel had first approached him shortly after Elinor's departure to Ashcombe Hall, requesting that certain financial matters be handled with what the Duke described as discretion appropriate to a wife's delicate health. Over time, these requests had grown increasingly bold, culminating in the direct forgery of Elinor's signature to authorize withdrawals that funded Seraphina's growing presence in London society. "Lady Vale was quite involved in these arrangements as well, Your Grace," Harding continued, his voice growing steadier as he committed fully to his account. "She frequently corresponded directly with me regarding specific expenditures, jewelry, gowns, the lease on her current residence. She understood clearly that these funds were being obtained through improper means, and she expressed no hesitation whatsoever in directing how they should be used. Aldridge, who had been taking careful notes throughout the conversation, looked up sharply at this. "Mr. Harding, would you be willing to provide these letters from Lady Vale as evidence, if you retained copies or if the originals still exist?" Harding nodded slowly. "I kept copies of certain correspondence, Your Grace, as a measure of protection for myself, understanding even then that I might one day need evidence of my own regarding who had truly directed these actions. They remain in a locked box among my personal effects, which I retained when I departed the household." Elinor felt a surge of quiet triumph at this revelation, understanding immediately how significantly this evidence would strengthen their case. Direct correspondence from Serafina, explicitly directing the use of improperly obtained funds, would eliminate any possibility of the Duke or his mistress claiming ignorance or innocence once the full truth came to light. "Mr. Harding," Elinor said carefully, "I would be most grateful if you would provide those letters to Mr. Aldridge, along with a formal written statement detailing everything you have told me today. I understand this represents a significant risk for you, and I want you to know that I will do everything within my power to ensure fair treatment, given your cooperation." "I will provide them, Your Grace," Harding said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been relief. "I have carried the weight of this deception for far too long. I confess I find myself grateful for the opportunity to finally set it right, whatever consequences may follow for my own part in this matter." As Elinor and Aldridge departed the inn later that afternoon, carrying with them Harding's promise to deliver both the letters and his formal statement within the coming days, Elinor felt the full weight of everything they had uncovered settling over her with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. The evidence was now overwhelming, more comprehensive than she could have imagined when she first began this careful investigation weeks earlier. Yet the sheer scope of the deception, the years of calculated betrayal that had unfolded during her absence, left her with a heaviness that no amount of legal vindication could fully dispel. "You have grown quiet, my lady," Aldridge observed as their carriage made its way back toward the fashionable part of the city. "I am thinking, Mr. Aldridge, about how much has changed since that night at the gala," Elinor said softly. "I came to London expecting at worst to confront an unfaithful husband. I did not expect to uncover a conspiracy of forgery and theft that has been unfolding for years, involving not only my husband and his mistress, but staff members who felt compelled either to participate or to flee out of fear." "Such is often the nature of these situations, my lady," Aldridge said gently. "Deception rarely remains contained to a single act. It tends to grow, requiring further deception to conceal the original transgression, until the entire structure becomes far larger and more complex than anyone involved initially intended." Elinor nodded slowly, staring out at the passing streets of London, illuminated now by the early evening lamplight. "Then I believe, Mr. Aldridge, that we have gathered sufficient evidence to proceed. It is time to consider how and when to bring this matter to its conclusion." "I agree, my lady. Once we have secured Mr. Harding's letters and formal statement, I believe we will possess a case comprehensive enough to bring before the appropriate legal authorities, should you choose that path. Alternatively," he added carefully, "there may be other approaches available to you, depending on what outcome you ultimately seek." "What do you mean, Mr. Aldridge?" "I mean, my lady, that legal proceedings, while they would certainly establish the truth of what has occurred and provide you with appropriate remedies under the law, would also become a matter of considerable public scandal. Given your husband's position and the visibility of Lady Vale within society, such proceedings would likely draw significant attention from the press and from society at large. There may be other paths available that would allow you to achieve justice and to secure your own future and protection without necessarily subjecting yourself to the full glare of public scrutiny that formal legal action would invite." Elinor considered this carefully, understanding the wisdom in Aldridge's caution, though she felt a growing certainty within herself about what outcome she truly sought. "I appreciate your counsel, Mr. Aldridge, and I will consider carefully what path serves my interests best. But I want you to understand something clearly. I do not seek merely to protect myself or to quietly extract myself from an unhappy marriage. I seek to ensure that the truth is known, that my husband and Lady Vale face genuine consequences for what they have done, and that no other woman finds herself deceived and humiliated in the manner I have experienced these past weeks. Whatever path achieves that outcome most effectively, That is the path I intend to pursue." Alderidge studied her for a long moment, a note of genuine respect entering his careful, professional expression. "Then, my lady, I believe we should begin preparing for the possibility of a more direct confrontation, one that would allow you to present the evidence we have gathered in a manner and setting of your own choosing, ensuring that you retain control over how, and when the truth becomes known, rather than surrendering that control to the uncertain and often unpredictable nature of formal legal proceedings." "Explain what you have in mind, Mr. Alderidge," Elinor said, leaning forward with renewed interest as their carriage continued through the darkening streets toward home. Alderidge outlined his thinking carefully over the remainder of their journey, describing a strategy that would allow Elinor to present the accumulated evidence in a controlled setting, before witnesses whose social standing and reputation would ensure the truth could not be easily dismissed or suppressed, while avoiding the lengthy and uncertain process of formal legal proceedings that might drag on for months or years before reaching resolution. By the time they arrived back at the townhouse, Elinor had begun to see the shape of a plan forming, one that would require careful timing and precise execution, but one that promised to deliver exactly the reckoning she had been quietly building toward since that fateful night at the winter gala. Nathaniel had grown increasingly restless in the weeks following the gala, a fact that had not escaped the notice of those closest to him. His usual confidence, the easy charm that had carried him through years of careless indulgence, had begun to fray at the edges, replaced by a nervous energy that showed itself in short tempers and sleepless nights. He found himself thinking constantly of Elinor's composed silence, of the way she moved through society now with a quiet certainty that unsettled him far more than any dramatic confrontation could have. "You are distracted again," Serafina observed one evening, watching him from across the drawing room of the townhouse he had leased for her. "You have hardly spoken a word all evening." "I am simply tired, Serafina," Nathaniel replied, though the lie sat poorly on his tongue. In truth, he had spent the past several days making careful inquiries of his own, attempting to understand exactly what his wife had been doing during her frequent visits to Lady Marlowe and her sudden appearance at Ashcombe House to collect personal belongings. The answers he had received offered little comfort, only a growing sense that something significant was unfolding just beyond his ability to fully perceive it. "You worry about her too much," Serafina said, moving to sit beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She curtsied and walked away. "Nathaniel, what harm can a woman do with nothing more than wounded pride and an empty title?" "You did not know her before her illness," Nathaniel said quietly, staring into the fire. "She was always the cleverest person in any room, even as a young bride. Her father taught her to think like a solicitor before she ever learned to dance properly. I dismissed that cleverness for years, believing it made her merely a useful, practical wife. I am beginning to wonder if I was wrong to dismiss it so easily." Serafina's expression flickered with something that might have been genuine concern, though it was quickly masked by her usual confident composure. "Whatever cleverness she possesses, Nathaniel, she has no power to act against you without your consent to any legal proceedings. You are the Duke. The law favors you in every meaningful respect." But Nathaniel was not entirely reassured by this reasoning, and his unease only deepened 3 days later when he received word that Harding, his former secretary, had been seen meeting privately with a barrister in a modest inn near the eastern edge of the city. The report reached him through a household servant who still maintained loyalty to the family, though even this small piece of information filled Nathaniel with a growing dread that he could no longer ignore or dismiss. He confronted Serafina with this news that same evening, watching her reaction carefully as he relayed what he had learned. Harding, meeting with a barrister. What could he possibly have to discuss? Serafina's composure faltered visibly for the first time since Nathaniel had known her, a flash of genuine alarm crossing her carefully maintained expression before she managed to regain control. "Harding knows nothing of any consequence, Nathaniel. He merely handled certain routine matters for the household." "Routine matters," Nathaniel repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face with new suspicion. "Serafina, I have never asked you directly how the funds for this residence, for your jewelry, for the countless expenses you have incurred these past 2 years, were obtained. I assumed simply that the estate provided for them as it always has. But if Harding is now meeting with barristers, and if my wife has been conducting her own quiet investigations these past weeks, I find myself wondering whether I have been entirely honest with myself about the nature of these arrangements. "Nathaniel, please," Serafina said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that Nathaniel had rarely heard from her before. "Whatever arrangements were necessary to maintain our life together, they were done out of necessity, out of love. You cannot fault me for wanting the life I believed you had promised me." "What arrangements, Serafina?" Nathaniel's voice had grown cold and demanding, the full weight of his growing suspicion finally breaking through the careful denial he had maintained for weeks. "Tell me plainly what you and Harding have done." Serafina hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal, before finally deciding that continued deception would serve her poorly given the circumstances. "The estate's regular allowance was never sufficient for the life you promised me, Nathaniel. Harding assisted in accessing additional funds that technically required your wife's signature for withdrawal. It was a simple matter, easily managed, and no harm was ever intended by it." Nathaniel stared at her, the full realization of what she was describing settling over him with a sickening clarity. "You forged her signature. You and Harding conspired to forge my wife's signature in order to fund your household, your jewelry, your entire presence in this city." "It was necessary, Nathaniel," Serafina insisted, though her earlier confidence had entirely evaporated, replaced by genuine fear as she watched the color drain from his face. "You wanted this life for us as much as I did. You never questioned where the funds came from, not once in 2 years." "Because I trusted that whatever you and Harding arranged was done properly," Nathaniel said, his voice barely above a whisper now, the enormity of the situation crashing over him in waves. "I did not ask because I did not wish to know the answer, because some part of me understood that whatever answer I received would be one I could not easily live with. But forgery, Serafina, is a serious crime. If Alina has discovered this, if she has gathered evidence sufficient to bring formal charges, we could both face consequences far beyond mere social embarrassment." The full weight of his own complicity, however passive, in this deception settled over Nathaniel with crushing force as he paced the length of the drawing room, his mind racing through the possible consequences of what had been uncovered. He had allowed himself the comfortable fiction that Serafina's lifestyle was simply funded through legitimate means, choosing willful ignorance over uncomfortable truth, and now that willful ignorance offered him no protection whatsoever from the legal and social consequences that might soon follow. "What do we do, Nathaniel?" Serafina asked, her voice small and frightened in a way Nathaniel had never witnessed before. "I do not know," Nathaniel admitted, sinking into a chair near the fire, his head in his hands. "I must speak with my own solicitor immediately, and I must attempt to understand exactly what Alina knows and what she intends to do with that knowledge. If she has indeed gathered sufficient evidence to bring formal proceedings, our best hope may lie in reaching some manner of private resolution before the matter becomes a public scandal that neither of us could survive." Over the following days, Nathaniel made increasingly desperate attempts to determine the full extent of Alina's knowledge and her intentions, though his inquiries yielded little useful information. Alina herself remained maddeningly composed whenever their paths crossed at social gatherings, offering him nothing beyond polite, distant courtesy that revealed absolutely nothing of the careful work being conducted behind the scenes. It was during this period of growing anxiety that Nathaniel finally sought out Lord Bright, hoping that his old friend might offer some insight into Alina's state of mind, given their apparent renewed closeness in recent weeks. "I will not betray any confidence Alina has shared with me, Nathaniel," Lord Bright said firmly, when Nathaniel raised the subject during a private meeting at his club. "But I will tell you this much, as an old friend who genuinely wishes to see you avoid further catastrophe. Alina is not a woman who acts rashly or without careful consideration. If she has indeed gathered evidence against you, as your own anxious inquiries seem to suggest you fear, then you may be certain that evidence is comprehensive and precisely documented. I would strongly advise you, Nathaniel, to consider carefully how you might begin repairing the damage you have caused, rather than continuing to search for ways to avoid or minimize the consequences you clearly know you deserve." Nathaniel left this conversation more troubled than before, the reality of his situation becoming increasingly undeniable with each passing day. He began to understand, with a clarity that had eluded him for years, exactly how thoroughly he had taken his wife's patience and composure for granted, mistaking her quiet dignity for weakness, her careful restraint for a lack of true understanding regarding the depth of his betrayal. Meanwhile, Alina continued her preparations with Alderidge, the two of them working steadily to organize the substantial body of evidence they had gathered into a comprehensive, undeniable presentation. Harding's letters from Serafina, promised during their meeting at the inn, arrived exactly as he had committed, providing direct written proof of Serafina's full knowledge and active direction of the improperly obtained funds. Combined with Margaret Wren's testimony, the bank records documenting the forged withdrawals, and Harding's own detailed confession, the case against Nathaniel and Serafina had grown into something far more comprehensive and undeniable than Alina could have imagined when she first began her careful investigation weeks earlier. "We are ready, my lady," Aldridge said one evening, as they reviewed the complete collection of evidence spread across the desk in Alina's study. "The question now is simply one of timing and setting. When and where do you wish to present this evidence, and to whom?" Alina considered this question carefully, understanding that the choice she made would shape not only the outcome of this particular confrontation, but the entire course of her future beyond it. "I have been thinking of this very question, Mr. Aldridge, and I believe I have arrived at a decision. Lady Marlowe has mentioned hosting a formal assembly in 3 weeks' time, one that will draw the full breadth of London society, including, I am certain, both my husband and Lady Vale. I believe that setting, public but controlled, attended by witnesses whose standing ensures the truth cannot be easily dismissed or suppressed, offers precisely the opportunity I have been seeking." "A bold choice, my lady," Aldridge said, though there was clear admiration in his tone. "Are you certain you wish to proceed with such a public revelation, rather than pursuing a more private resolution through formal legal channels?" "I am certain, Mr. Aldridge," Alina said firmly. "I was humiliated publicly before 300 witnesses without a single word spoken in my defense. I believe it is only fitting that the truth should be revealed with equal visibility, ensuring that no one who witnessed my humiliation remains ignorant of the true circumstances that led to it, and ensuring that my husband and Lady Vale can no longer hide behind carefully maintained appearances and social standing." Aldridge nodded slowly, beginning to organize the evidence into a clear, methodical presentation that Alina could deliver with confidence and precision when the moment finally arrived. "Then, my lady, let us ensure that when that evening comes, your presentation is as flawless and undeniable as the composure you demonstrated on the night of the gala. This time, however, silence will not be your only weapon. This time the truth itself will speak, clearly and completely, for everyone in that room to hear." The 3 weeks leading up to Lady Marlowe's formal assembly passed with an unusual quality of stillness, the kind of tense, waiting quiet that precedes a great storm. Alina spent her days refining every detail of her presentation with Aldridge, ensuring that each piece of evidence flowed logically into the next, building an undeniable case that would leave no room for doubt or excuse once it was fully revealed. She also spent time with Lady Marlowe herself, who had agreed, once informed of the full situation, to lend her considerable social influence, and the setting of her own home to ensure the revelation would carry the weight and permanence Alina sought. "You understand, my dear," the Countess said during one of their final preparatory meetings, "that once this is done, there will be no returning to quiet obscurity. Whatever happens that evening will become the talk of London for months, perhaps years, to come." "I understand completely, Lady Marlowe," Alina replied. "I have considered this carefully, and I remain certain of my choice. I have spent this past year first in illness, then in quiet retreat, then in careful, patient investigation. I do not intend to spend the remainder of my life hiding from the consequences of my husband's actions. I intend to face them directly, and to ensure that the truth, once revealed, cannot be quietly buried or forgotten." The Countess studied her for a long moment, a look of genuine admiration crossing her sharp features. "Your father would be very proud, Alina. I do not say that lightly. He was a man who believed deeply in the power of undeniable truth, carefully documented and precisely presented. I see that same conviction in you now." As the evening of the assembly approached, Nathaniel's own anxiety had grown to nearly unbearable levels. He had made several attempts to speak privately with Alina in the preceding weeks, hoping to negotiate some manner of quiet resolution before matters could escalate further, but Alina had consistently declined these requests, offering only polite, non-committal responses that gave him no insight into her true intentions. "Perhaps she intends nothing at all," Serafina suggested one evening, though her own confidence had never fully recovered since the revelation of Harding's meeting with Aldridge weeks earlier. "Perhaps she has simply been occupying herself, and no formal action is coming. I do not believe that, Serafina, Nathaniel said grimly. I know my wife too well, even after all these years of taking her for granted. If she has been quiet these past weeks, it is because she has been building toward something, not because she has abandoned whatever course she set for herself on the night of the gala. The night of Lady Marlowe's assembly arrived on a clear, cold evening in early spring, the first genuine warmth of the season beginning to soften the harsh grip of winter that had held London in its embrace for months. The Countess's grand townhouse glowed with candlelight as guests began arriving in their finest attire, the assembly drawing, as promised, the full breadth of London's most prominent society members, eager to see and be seen at one of the season's most anticipated gatherings. Elena arrived precisely on time, dressed in a gown of deep, elegant burgundy that Lady Marlowe had helped her select specifically for its commanding presence, a color that spoke of strength and quiet authority rather than the softer, more decorative colors she had favored in earlier years of her marriage. She carried herself with the same composed dignity that had become her signature since the night of the gala, though tonight, beneath that composure, she felt a steady current of determination that had been building for weeks. Nathaniel and Serafina arrived nearly an hour later, and Elena watched from across the crowded ballroom as her husband scanned the gathering with obvious anxiety, clearly searching for some sign of what awaited him that evening. Serafina, for her part, had dressed with even greater care than usual, as though attempting through sheer visual splendor to reclaim some of the confidence that had eroded steadily over the preceding weeks. The evening proceeded initially much like any other formal assembly, with dancing and conversation and the usual careful maneuvering of London society, each guest positioning themselves advantageously among the crowd, gathering gossip and forming alliances as they had done at countless similar gatherings throughout their lives. Elena moved through this familiar rhythm with practiced grace, dancing once with Lord Bright, speaking briefly with several old acquaintances, all while waiting patiently for the moment she and Aldridge had carefully planned to arrive. That moment came just past 10 in the evening, when Lady Marlowe, following the plan she and Elena had discussed in careful detail, called for the attention of her assembled guests, announcing that a matter of some importance required brief consideration before the evening's festivities could properly continue. The orchestra fell silent, and the assembled crowd turned their attention toward the small raised platform near the head of the ballroom, where the Countess now stood, flanked by Elena on one side, and at a respectful distance, Aldridge holding a leather case containing the carefully organized evidence they had spent weeks assembling. "My friends," the Countess began, her sharp voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "I have called you together this evening not merely for the pleasure of dancing and conversation, welcome though that always is, but because a matter of considerable importance has come to my attention, one that I believe concerns the integrity and honor of a family well known to us all." A ripple of curious murmurs spread through the crowd, and Elena could see, across the room, the color draining rapidly from her husband's face as he began to understand what was unfolding. Serafina's hand tightened visibly on his arm, her own expression shifting from confusion to dawning alarm. "Some weeks ago," the Countess continued, "many of you witnessed a remarkable scene at the Winter Gala, when the Duchess of Ashcombe returned from a lengthy absence to find her husband presenting another woman in a manner that suggested she held the position rightfully belonging to his lawful wife. Many of you, I suspect, drew your own conclusions about that evening, some sympathetic to the Duchess, others perhaps less charitable in their assumptions about what such a display might signify." Elena stepped forward slightly, her voice calm and steady as she addressed the assembled crowd directly for the first time. "I stand before you tonight not to seek pity or sympathy, but to present facts, carefully documented and verified, that I believe every person in this room deserves to understand, given the public nature of my humiliation on that earlier evening." She nodded to Aldridge, who stepped forward and opened the leather case, beginning to present, in clear and methodical fashion, the evidence they had spent weeks so carefully assembling. He explained the marriage settlement first, establishing clearly the legal boundaries that govern the Ashcombe estate's finances and the protections it afforded Elena regarding both the family jewelry and any significant financial transactions. He then presented the bank records, documenting the pattern of withdrawals that exceeded these established boundaries, withdrawals that had funded a lifestyle for Lady Vale entirely inconsistent with any legitimate claim to the resources being used. Gasps and whispers spread through the ballroom as Aldridge continued, presenting Margaret Wren's sworn statement regarding the forgery of Alina's signature, followed by Harding's own detailed confession and the damning letters from Serafina herself, directly implicating her in the knowing and deliberate misuse of improperly obtained funds. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of calculated deception that no amount of social standing or careful denial could hope to dismiss. Throughout this presentation, Alina stood quietly beside Aldridge, her composure unwavering, watching as the assembled guests, many of whom had witnessed her humiliation weeks earlier at the Winter Gala, now witnessed instead the full unraveling of the deception that had led to that humiliation. She watched Nathaniel's face grow increasingly pale and stricken, watched Serafina's carefully maintained composure crumble entirely as the letters bearing her own handwriting were read aloud for the assembled crowd to hear. "This is preposterous," Nathaniel finally managed to say, his voice strained as he pushed forward through the crowd toward the platform, though the murmurs and stares of the assembled guests made clear that his protest carried little weight against the overwhelming evidence just presented. "These documents could be fabricated, manipulated to serve my wife's purposes. The bank officials who verified these records are present this evening, Your Grace, should you wish to question them directly," Aldridge said calmly, gesturing toward a small group of solemn-faced men standing near the edge of the crowd, men whose professional reputation and standing left little room for doubt regarding their testimony. As is Mrs. Wren and Mr. Harding himself, both of whom have provided sworn statements and remain willing to testify further, should formal legal proceedings become necessary. The full weight of the evidence, combined with the presence of the witnesses themselves, left Nathaniel with nowhere to turn, no argument sufficient to counter the comprehensive case that had been so carefully and methodically assembled against him. He stood frozen at the front of the crowd, the ruin of his careful deception laid bare before the very society whose good opinion he had always valued above nearly everything else. Serafina, for her part, had gone entirely silent, her face a mask of horror as she realized the full extent of what had just been revealed, understanding immediately that whatever position she had hoped to secure within London society had just been utterly and irrevocably destroyed before the very people whose acceptance she had so carefully cultivated. Alina watched this unfolding devastation with a complex mixture of emotions. The vindication she had sought for weeks now mingled with a strange, unexpected sorrow at witnessing the complete collapse of a marriage and a life she had once genuinely believed in. But beneath these mingled feelings, she felt also a profound sense of clarity, a certainty that whatever came next, she had done what was necessary, had refused to accept quiet humiliation, and had instead demanded the truth be known fully and undeniably before the entire society that had witnessed her original disgrace. In the days that followed the assembly, London society could speak of little else, the story spreading rapidly through every drawing room and gentlemen's club in the city, growing more detailed with each retelling, until it seemed that half of London believed they had witnessed the confrontation firsthand. The Duke of Ashcombe found himself facing a reckoning far more severe and far-reaching than mere social embarrassment, as the evidence presented at Lady Marlowe's assembly quickly made its way into formal legal channels, no longer able to be quietly suppressed or dismissed once so many prominent witnesses had heard the full account directly. Within a week, Nathaniel found himself summoned before legal authorities to answer for the forged financial documents, facing serious questions regarding his knowledge of and complicity in the scheme that had defrauded the estate of substantial funds. His solicitors worked frantically to limit the damage, but the comprehensive nature of Alina's evidence, combined with Harding's detailed and corroborated testimony, left little room for effective defense. The most Nathaniel could hope for was a resolution that avoided formal criminal prosecution, achieved only through significant financial penalties and a formal, humiliating acknowledgement of the deception that had occurred under his direction and with his tacit approval. Serafina fared far worse in the aftermath. Stripped of the social standing she had worked so carefully to cultivate, abandoned quickly by the fair-weather friends who had once courted her favor when they believed she might genuinely rise to a position of influence, she found herself facing not only social ruin, but potential legal consequences of her own, given the direct evidence of her knowing participation in the forgery scheme through her own correspondence with Harding. Within a month of the assembly, she had departed London entirely, her reputation too thoroughly destroyed to salvage any meaningful position within the society she had once hoped to conquer. Elinor, meanwhile, found herself navigating an entirely new set of circumstances following the revelation, one that required careful consideration of what future she truly wished to build for herself. The formal dissolution of her marriage, pursued through the appropriate legal channels with Aldridge's careful guidance, proceeded with far greater speed and favorable terms than might otherwise have been possible, given the overwhelming evidence of Nathaniel's misconduct and the clear breach of the protective marriage settlement her father had so carefully constructed years earlier. "You have secured not only your freedom, my lady, but a settlement that ensures your complete financial independence going forward," Aldridge informed her one afternoon, several weeks after the formal proceedings had concluded, as they reviewed the final documents together in the familiar study of her father's townhouse. "The estate has been required to compensate you fully for the misappropriated funds, and the terms of the settlement your father originally negotiated ensure that you retain both the family jewelry and a substantial independent income, regardless of your marital status going forward." Elinor sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the full weight of this conclusion to the long, difficult journey that had begun on that cold winter evening months earlier. "My father protected me even from beyond the grave," she said softly. "I do not believe I fully appreciated, until these past months, exactly how thoroughly he anticipated the possibility that I might one day need such protection. He was a man who understood better than most the ways in which trust can be betrayed, my lady," Aldridge said gently. "I believe he hoped never to see such protections become necessary, but he ensured they existed nonetheless should the need ever arise." In the months that followed the formal conclusion of her marriage, Elinor found herself gradually rebuilding a life that felt entirely her own for the first time since her youth. She maintained her father's townhouse as her permanent residence, finding a quiet contentment in the familiar rooms filled with memories of a childhood spent watching her father work through complex legal matters with the same patience and precision she had come to rely upon during her own difficult months of investigation and revelation. Lady Marlowe remained a steady and valued friend throughout this transition, frequently inviting Elinor to gatherings and introducing her to a wider circle of independent, capable women who had similarly navigated the complexities of London society on their own terms. Margaret Wren, whose courage in coming forward had proven so instrumental to Elinor's case, found herself offered a permanent position within Elinor's own household, a gesture of gratitude and protection that Elinor insisted upon despite Margaret's initial hesitation to accept such generosity. Lord Bright, whose quiet friendship and support had sustained Elinor through the most difficult moments of her ordeal, continued to visit regularly, and though neither of them spoke openly of it, a gentle, growing warmth had begun to develop between them, one built not upon the desperate urgency of a society marriage arrangement, but upon genuine mutual respect and understanding that had deepened steadily through months of shared adversity and careful, patient trust. "You seem genuinely content, Elinor," Lord Bright observed one evening, as they sat together in her father's study, the fire crackling warmly against the autumn chill that had begun to settle over London. "I confess I did not know, when I offered you my arm on that terrible night at the gala, that I would witness such a remarkable transformation over the months that followed." "I did not know it myself, Callum," Elinor admitted, a genuine smile touching her lips as she looked around the familiar room that had become, once again, truly her own. "I came to London that night expecting only humiliation and uncertainty. I found instead a strength within myself that I had perhaps always possessed, but had never before been forced to fully discover." "Your father would be proud of what you have accomplished," Lord Bright said quietly. "I believe he would," Elinor agreed. "Though I suspect he would remind me, as he always did, that the true measure of strength lies not in the victory itself, but in how one chooses to move forward afterward, carrying forward the lessons learned without allowing bitterness to define the future." Elinor had, indeed, given considerable thought to exactly this question in the months since the assembly, understanding that while the vindication she had sought and achieved brought genuine satisfaction, it could not be allowed to become the sole defining feature of the remainder of her life. She had begun, in recent weeks, to take an active interest in her father's former legal practice, working closely with Aldridge to understand the intricacies of estate law and financial protection that had proven so crucial to her own case, finding within this work a genuine sense of purpose that extended far beyond the resolution of her own difficult circumstances. "I have been considering, Mr. Aldridge," she said during one of their regular meetings, several months after the formal conclusion of her legal proceedings, "whether there might be value in establishing some manner of formal assistance for women who find themselves in circumstances similar to my own, women who lack the resources or knowledge to protect themselves against the kind of deception I experienced." Aldridge looked up with genuine interest at this suggestion. "What did you have in mind, my lady?" "Perhaps a formal practice, one that specializes in exactly the kind of protective legal work my father excelled at, ensuring that other women entering marriage arrangements possess the same careful protections he provided for me, and offering assistance to those who, like myself, find themselves needing to investigate and address betrayal within their own households." Eleanor's eyes had taken on the same determined clarity that had carried her through the difficult months of her investigation. "I possess both the resources and, I believe, the understanding now to make such an endeavor genuinely valuable, should you be willing to partner with me in establishing it." Aldridge considered this proposal carefully before responding, a slow smile spreading across his usually composed features. "I believe, my lady, that your father would be exceptionally proud to see his life's work continued in exactly this manner. I would be honored to partner with you in such an endeavor." And so, in the months that followed, Eleanor began the work of establishing what would eventually become one of London's most respected practices, specializing in the protection of women's interests within marriage and inheritance, drawing upon her own painful experience to ensure that other women, facing similarly difficult circumstances, would have access to the same careful, methodical protection that had ultimately allowed her to reclaim both her dignity and her future. The story of the Duke who had presented his mistress as the Duchess, and the wife whose silent curtsy had ultimately led to his complete undoing, became, over time, a cautionary tale told throughout London society, a reminder that quiet composure should never be mistaken for weakness, and that patient, methodical determination could accomplish what dramatic confrontation never could. Eleanor herself rarely spoke of the events directly, preferring instead to let her ongoing work and her genuine, hard-won contentment speak for themselves. She had learned through the painful journey that began on that cold winter evening that true strength lay not in loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, but in the patient, careful gathering of undeniable truth, presented at precisely the right moment, before precisely the right witnesses, in a manner that could never again be dismissed, denied, or forgotten. And in the years that followed, as her practice grew and her friendship with Lord Bright deepened into something genuinely lasting, Eleanor found that the woman who had once curtsied silently before her husband and his mistress had, through patience and determination, become something far stronger and more enduring than the title of Duchess had ever truly represented, a woman who had reclaimed not merely her position in society, but her own sense of purpose, dignity, and unshakable self-worth.